AI. Apple gets the benefit of the doubt. They present a story. And this is probably a weak point for me because I do look at things generally structurally and where companies are. And yeah, this idea that Apple owns the device, they have access to your private data, they can sort of provide an experience that no one else can, and then hand off sort of broader tasks to the large foundation models. They can maybe set up an auction to have access on the device. It's like a replay of the Google search deal. They're the AI aggregator, like all these ideas that we talked about that all make elegant sense. And the problem with all of the strategic thinking, and I put myself critiquing myself in this basket, is you still have to execute. And I think if you listen to our podcast, and I think if you go back to what I wrote, we said, assuming they pull it off.
Right.
But we didn't say it with our chest, or at least I wasn't saying it with my chest. It was sort of assuming they pull it off, and they're Apple, they'll pull it off.
In retrospect, there wasn't enough acknowledgement that what Apple was selling at last year's WWDC was, in fact, ahead of the state of the art.
Right.
From
that's exactly
AI
it. No,
capabilities.
that's why I'm not giving myself an excuse. I should take the L. That was John Gruber's point when he wrote Something's Rotten in the State of Cupertino. He opened up being mad at himself. He's like,
right.
How did they couldn't even demo this stuff? Why did I assume that could happen? And you put it in the context of they were promising an experience that OpenAI couldn't deliver, that Anthropic couldn't deliver, that Google couldn't deliver, particularly the Google one, because Google has access to your private data. And why is Apple going to pull this off? And it's even worse than that, because it's not just that the general, like, comparative to their AI companies, but Apple historically, culturally, this is the kind of stuff they're not good at. They're not good at dealing with a gazillion edge cases, failing gracefully. Apple's good at building finished products. They build operating systems that have to ship. They build phones. An even better example, that in September, that phone is going to be in a box, on a shelf, in a customer's hand, and you don't get to go back and iterate.
And the OS has to be ready at that point.
That's right.
Yeah.
And it's just a very different way of working. And I think companies that are good at one of those ways at working are intrinsically bad at the opposite. And again, this is why I have to take the L. I've written exactly that about Apple, that they're bad at those sorts of things. And there was a bit, I just gave them too much of the benefit of the doubt, and in violation of my own previous thinking and principles, and in violation of the broader context of the industry. And in retrospect, given that, for Apple to get up there, and it's funny, like, they're very mad at John for that article, but they basically in every aspect of this keynote said, John, you were right. That was the takeaway.
You were right. Let's take a beat.
We look forward in the coming year talking about XYZ. At least they admitted it up front. And then everything else was stuff they could do. And everything that they showed, they demoed. And it was just sort of a, look, before you try again, you have to reset and, like, get your house in order. This felt like a getting your house in order sort of keynote. And yes, there was the big UI redesign, and it's going to be a mess. People are going to complain about it. This happens with UI redesigns. I'll withhold judgment on it. You probably should withhold judgment it might even be a couple years. iOS 7 was really rough. It wasn't until iOS 9 or 10 that it sort of really settled in. This is going to be the nature of it. But this is also what Apple does. Apple makes user interfaces, right? They're in their wheelhouse. Yeah. And that's not very exciting. It's not very sexy. But Apple needed to be not exciting and not sexy because they went so far off the reservation in terms of execution over the last year.
Well, and among the things they announced, they are, in fact, opening up on-device AI models to developers, exactly as you've been recommending for the past couple months on this podcast. And so now that it's official, can you remind people why exactly you endorse this approach for Apple?
Well, I mean, the on-device model is interesting. Like just to be clear, and this is sort of goes in the obvious things that still need to be said and should have been more strongly said last year. An on-device model is going to be vastly inferior to your ChatGPT
Anything in the
experience
cloud.
that's running in the
Yeah.
cloud on like on massive NVIDIA GPUs. That's like the physics of computing. It's running on your phone in your hand on a battery. That's not comparable to a $50,000 NVIDIA GPU or a whole host of them that's in the cloud.
Mm-hmm.
And it was fundamentally flawed for Apple to anchor so strongly on that, because they're basically committing to delivering a worse experience because it's not capable enough. They're dressing it up in privacy in these sorts of things. It's also a big cost savings. It's like, oh yeah, it's because it's using the user's power, right? It's using the user's chip that's already. And I'm sorry, Apple, you don't get to save money and sell it as a feature, right?
Well,
So
and when we say Apple anchoring on that, they were going to deliver all the on-device AI, and it was all going to have Apple's name on it, and then perform worse than anything that's operating in the cloud.
right.
That's the core problem with that.
Well, there is a point that's that I do want to bring up about that, which I'll come to in a second. But the thing with letting developers do it is developers, in the most idealized version of the App Store, you have sort of like the one person shop, and they're just shipping an app on the App Store, and the App Store is amazing and lets them build this business doing whatever it might be. I think a great example is Marco Arment, who a lot of people listening to this, you might be listening on Overcast. He makes a podcast client, and someone like that, they can't use AI in the cloud. It's not compatible with their business model, to say the least. And even sort of the expense and expertise required to do something compelling, if you're only one person, you're not going to pull that off. But Marco, for example, one thing he would like to offer is transcription of podcasts. And that's something that is, we'll see how it works once he gets access to these models, but he could theoretically offer, now that it's for free. And in this case, the free isn't Apple saving money. The free is developers can do stuff they couldn't do before, or they couldn't afford to do when everything sort of had to be in the cloud, because they have access to a local model. They have access to the user's power to sort of pull these sorts of things off. And the great thing from an Apple perspective is, suppose Marco builds this and it stinks. Marco's got to deal with the bad reviews.
People complain about
grumpy.
Overcast.
That's right. It's not Apple's problem, right? If it's awesome, suddenly, oh yeah, the podcast players on iPhone platforms have transcription. The ones on Android, maybe they do if you have a high-end Android. If you have a low-end one, it's going to be iffy, right? You have this whole unit. You're back in the Android has, because they cover everything, you don't get a consistent user experience. You don't know what you're targeting. Apple only sells a few iPhones, and they're pretty high-end. And so if you get it, you're going to get a better experience. So their upside here is you have differentiated apps on your platform. And again, maybe the vast majority, maybe it'll turn out these on-device models are just insufficient for everything. That's fine. There's no harm lost, but people are going to experiment, and they're going to find weird things that you never thought to use AI for, but you can experiment because it's free.
And strategically, that's so much smarter for Apple because you're weaponizing the long tail to your benefit. And the one thing that has come through with the last couple WWDCs is that Apple, left to its own devices and its own ideas, doesn't really have any idea what to do with AI. Like Image Playground is a punchline, but again, every time they come back to Image Playground, I'm like, this is a mess. Like, who does this exist for? And then like merging emojis and stuff like that. Like there were some grown moments during WWDC, and I trust a universe of developers to come up with cooler, more experimental ways to use AI and optimize it than I trust Apple at this point. And so on that basis alone,
Apple
it's a no-brainer.
Now, the one thing
but now they do,
well,
sort of, maybe.
So the way Apple does generally release features, or whether it be a new API or a new capability, is they do usually do it themselves first. And so they can figure out how it works. They can dog food it. They have to build with it. And
what does dog food it mean?
Where you use it yourself. So say there's an API here. So there's an API to use this language model. Apple was working against that API for the last year and a half to build the features that they wanted to build. It was Polygon or whatever it might be. So they probably made changes to that and said, oh, this actually doesn't work well as a developer doing X, Y, Z. And then a year later, then it's broadly available. And the problem with making something broadly available is then you have to support it forever. And so I do. It's very possible Apple actually always intended to make the local models available this year. It actually is historically in their cadence to first do it themselves for a year. And again, part of that is, yes, they want to get the benefit, but there's actually real legitimate platform reasons for them to do it first. And then it was always going to be available for developers now. But that said, I'll take the W. So I started out with a string of L's. So if we want to sit here and say, yes, Apple listened to Ben, sure,